Thanks to Mazars for the invitation to come along and talk to you today. So my talk over about the next 10 or 15 minutes or so is sort of a bit broader. I want to talk about the economy more generally, but of course it's very tied into the budget. I mean, at one level, and Frank has mentioned this already, the resources that we have available have a lot to do with the structure of the economy and the fact that there are so many foreign multinationals here. So I want to talk a little bit about what's sort of evolving there. And of course, budgets can have an impact on the economy as well. Okay, so just a sort of a quick point on this. Many years ago, the finance minister, Charlie McCreevy, was criticised quite robustly when he used the phrase, when I have the money, I'll spend it. Okay, and it seemed to be that collectively we as a nation started to understand that fiscal policy and the fiscal stance matters a lot, and that really what we should be aiming for is counter-cyclical budgetary policy. Okay, now that sounds like a bit of a mouthful, but I think most people on the line are going to understand what that means. Generally, you want fiscal policy when the economy is in a downturn. You want an expansionary fiscal policy, so the government in a sense is sort of providing buffers, and then when the economy is doing well, you want the government to do the exact opposite. Okay, you want the government to have a sort of a prudent and a cautious fiscal policy, whereby the resources are then going to be available for later on. So this message, I think, has got a little bit lost, all right? And one of the reasons for that is a lot of people this time around in this budget interpreted caution as not spending all the windfall corporate tax gains. Okay, that was the definition of caution. But of course, the notion of counter-cyclical fiscal policy is a bit deeper than that. But let's tease it out a little bit anyway, and we'll see where we end up. Okay, so like I said, I want to give a sort of an oversight, an overview of happenings in the economy. And I'm drawing on the work of some colleagues, which was published about a week ago in our quarterly economic commentary. So you can see on the slide there, we've got forecasts of GDP and modified domestic demand. And we all know for 2002, we had this massive post-COVID bounce back and the economy was doing extremely well. Okay, as we've come into 2023 and as the year has progressed though, a number of concerns have started to emerge. Okay, I'll talk a little bit more deeply about this as we go along. But it is important to note that the multinational activity, okay, which was the source of so much of the buoyancy of the economy, is contracting somewhat. Okay, and that's why we have on the screen there a GDP forecast for 2023 of minus 1.6%. So it seems quite extraordinary, actually, in spite of all the positivity, that on that narrow measure of the Irish economy, that it looks like we'll be technically in recession. I think everybody on the call again knows that we don't have to get too hung up about the GDP numbers, but look even at the modified domestic demand. Okay, my colleagues are using the word normalization. Okay, so normal countries have growth rates of between sort of 1% and 3% per annum. So the sort of figures we were seeing in Ireland for quite a while were not normal, but it seems we're sort of gliding towards normality to a great extent. And then you can see for 2024, again, growth rates that are more in the ballpark of normality. So I'll say a little bit more about what's sort of driving these figures, but just also say I think I'll say a little bit more about inflation later on too. So I'll flag it there, but I'll talk about it when the relevant slide comes up. Okay, so again, people on the call who remember doing their economics in college, the old identity of gross domestic product being made of C plus I plus G plus exports minus imports. If you were all in the room with me now, I'd be asking that question and would have given bonus points for those who had known the answer. So just to interpret the figure here, the solid blue lines are blue bars. That's growth between 21 and 22, okay? And then you can see the various components. So you can see all those chunky blue bars meant that consumption was growing very robustly, government spending increased, investment, exports and imports, okay? Everything you want. Okay, the green dots are what's been happening so far in 2023, okay? And the important thing here is the two green dots that are lying below the line. All right, so investment for this year is running below, is actually in negative territory, as are exports. Okay, the investment figure isn't entirely surprising. There are some base effects to do with the post-COVID bounce back. But nevertheless, those negatives are very, very important. And even if you look over at the consumption section there, you see the green dot way lower. Okay, so the trajectory we seem to be in for 2023 is just a good deal lower than where we previously were. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more then about the consumption figure that I put in there. Okay, so again, back to 2022, we had that massive surge. 2023, we expect consumption to grow by about 3%, so a long way down. Okay, but what's going on here? Okay, so there's a number of points. I won't necessarily go into all of them. Obviously, the inflationary pressures are now having an impact on households. Okay, so they're facing, their budgets are squeezed, so that's sort of depressing consumption. But I'm going to actually go straight to the next slide because there's an interesting point here. Okay, so see the picture on the left-hand side there where we've got a blue bar and we've got a green bar. All right, so the blue line, that was the early estimate of the savings ratio. Okay, so that's the Central Statistics Office come up with a sort of figure, basically talking about across the nation what proportion of income is being saved. Okay, and you can see the blue line, okay, from Q3 2021, the line seems to be going up. It seems that savings were quite elevated. All right, and there was a lot of talk around this time about this sort of savings glut, and would this savings glut then sort of spill out into Ireland and have that really sort of strong effect on economic growth. But it turns out actually that the data often does get revised. This isn't the CSO do this regularly, as do all international statistical agencies, so it's not a criticism. But you can see actually that the savings rate had been declining in a way that we hadn't expected. So when we were previously doing forecasts of consumption, we were factoring in this high levels of savings, which we thought were going to materialize, okay, spill into consumption. But as you can see, the savings rate has normalized to a much greater degree. And if anything, the savings rate is going up ever so slightly again, which is probably a thing about people reacting to uncertainties such as interest rates, inflation, and some of those other factors. Okay, the picture on the right-hand side, okay, there's one point to be made here. Okay, very, very often, Ireland's economic statistics just look different. Okay, sometimes it's very different on the upside, and from time to time it's very different on the downside. But if you look at the green line in the figure there, you can see at various points, consumption was growing in Ireland and much more strongly than other European countries. But if you come to the end of the picture there, you see for Q2 2023, the most recent data, you see that Ireland has essentially now rejoined the pack. All right, and that's kind of when I would use the phrase earlier on about normalization. Okay, that return to more normal growth rates, I think, is now manifesting itself. Okay, I talked earlier on about exports declining, and let's go a little bit more deeply into this. Okay, and I mean, essentially at the moment, you cannot talk about the Irish economy without talking about ICT and pharma in particular. Okay, these are just the sort of, they're dominant sectors in terms of explaining the recent growth trajectory, and they're dominant sectors in terms of explaining an awful lot of the corporation tax. Okay, so very, very important that we understand what's going on here. Okay, and when I talked about exports now beginning to decline, most of that effect is actually to do with pharma. Okay, ICT is actually holding up much better than you might have realized, because again, if you think about all the headlines around job losses in some of the major ICT firms, that doesn't seem to be actually sort of translating into output in that sector. So again, I can give you another picture of this. This is once again where we've got blue bars which said, this is what happened in the earlier part of the year. The green dot is the most recent data, and you can see goods exports are now estimated to be falling by about 9.5%. The services, okay, and that's primarily ICT, you can still see is in positive territory. So we have this sort of a divergence across these two major sectors. And again, back to the picture then on the right-hand side, this is another one where I want to sort of compare Ireland to a lot of European countries. Okay, and these were again export end, the growth rates in exports. You can see there a substantial part of the picture. Ireland is lying way above the European competitors, but now we seem to have converged to where the rest of them were. Okay, I don't need to go this in great detail because it's essentially saying the same thing. It's looking at services growing on the one hand and looking at computer services, and then on the other side we're seeing those lines below the bar. It's still a bit of a shock to the system. We're not used to seeing lines going into negative territory in Ireland. So, obviously there's a question then about sort of, how long is this going to last? But important to be cognizant of what's happening. Okay, I mentioned earlier on investment is another component of the story where we seem to be, the GDP growths are being drawn down. Not entirely surprising. Okay, colleagues at the Institute have done work. I mean, by definition, the reason interest rates are being increased are to reduce demand in the economy. Some of that comes through the consumption channel, but a lot of it comes through the investment channel as well. Okay, so it would have been absolutely staggering if we had seen the increases in interest rates at the level that we had, and that we hadn't seen corresponding falls in investment. But that is now clearly happening and is showing up in the data. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about the labour market as well. Again, not a great detail, but there's particular points I want to make. I mean, I kicked off the talk by talking about this notion of counter-cyclical fiscal policy. And so the question is, should the budget be expansionary or contractionary? Okay, and everything I've sort of said so far has been like sort of talking about the slowing in the economy, which might lead you to think, okay, well, maybe actually this is an opportunity or the time to start stimulating. All right, but with reference to the labour market, I think the answer to that particular question is no, it's too early. All right, so let's look at the picture rather than sort of going through the words. So if you see the green line there, okay, that's the unemployment rate. And what you can see is Ireland's unemployment rate is now really at a remarkably low level. Okay, 5% is almost, and I think it's even lower than that, depending on the definition. Okay, but we're at an irreducible minimum, actually. Now, if you look at the blue line, that's the the number of vacant jobs. Okay, so you can see there the number of vacancies peaked. It is trailing off a little bit. Okay, but there's not an awful lot of evidence to suggest that the labour market is, in a sense, beginning to exhibit any slack, whereby those notions of sort of compensatory fiscal stimuluses are required. Okay, I also said I'd say a little bit about inflation. So here's the picture of inflation. Apologies for looking at my watch. I'm just eager that we get to some questions and answers. Okay, certainly you can see clearly from the picture there on the right-hand side where we've got euro area, HICP, Ireland as well, and you can see that inflation has certainly come down from the heights of about a year ago. But the problem, of course, is if you look at the right-hand part of the line isn't just coming down continuously. All right, and we've got this difficulty now, possibly at least, whereby the first sort of surge in inflation was related to energy. Then food prices started being part of the issue. And then the question now is, are we going to start seeing, or have we seen already, impacts on wages whereby inflation is actually modestly embedded in the economy? Okay, it's too early to say really what the answer to that is. My colleagues, given it their best shot, have sort of estimated that inflation will indeed come down next year. And you can see, for example, hiccup inflation would be about 2.8%. We can hope that that's going to be the case, but I think this is something to be kept under review. Okay, this is a slightly different slide, okay, but let me talk about it very briefly because I think it's really important actually in two contexts. Okay, so I'll explain what's going on here and then we'll get into the details. So look at the right-hand side and look at the top panel. Okay, and what this is, Ireland's ranking and current and capital expenditure. So what my colleagues have essentially done here is that they've looked at government spending across current and capital per head. Okay, and the green line is capital spending and the blue line is current. All right, and here's the important point. At various stages or various times, Ireland has ranked very, very highly on capital expenditure, but then we had this kind of significant dip, and then we're on the way up again. Okay, and some of that line explains some of the bottlenecks that we actually have in the economy because we haven't been able to maintain sort of consistent levels of infrastructural investment. What is really, really sort of pleasing about yesterday's announcement was this notion of trying to set up funds that will sort of smooth capital investment over time. So I think that's really, really positive. The blue line, I'm just going to put it up there and others can talk about it if they want, but this question always comes up. Are we a high-taxed country or a low-tax country or a medium-tax country? All right, and everybody tends to answer that question with reference to their personal paycheck and income tax. But of course, we know in Ireland, for example, national insurance contributions are lower, wealth taxes are lower. So if you want to look at the totality of government in the economy, one way is to look at the totality of spending or the totality of tax. My colleagues have done this here. You see the blue line there. Where does Ireland rank across the European Union in terms of current expenditure? And you can kind of see we're actually a mid-ranking country. All right, so it's not entirely clear where you hear all the time about squeezed middles and the high tax burden and everything like that. The data on Ireland, and if you look at it comparatively, is a little different. Okay, I know I've rattled through a whole load of points, and is eager to get the questions and answers. But rather than talking in detail, let me just sort of take a minute to give a sort of two overview points, okay, on the budget. So the first, I began with the question about counter-cyclical fiscal policy. I think it is, it is probably the case that the budget is overly stimulatory relative to where it should be. My former colleagues in the Irish Fiscal Advisory Council have made that point, and I think others will make that point as well. But I'm not so naive as to stand up here and say that economic security is always going to drive budgetary decisions. There is a political reality. And let me put it like this. Sometimes when I was on the Fiscal Council, people would say, are you being ignored? I think the degree of the sort of counter-cyclicality in the wrong way might have been an awful lot higher if you hadn't had people like the Fiscal Council and others making points. Last point I'll make then, the value of the funds that have been set up. This is actually quite far-sighted, and there was a certain amount of discussion yesterday that this was the first time the Fianna Fáil minister was giving the budget in many, many years. I was talking about Charlie McCreevy earlier on. This might be unusual that we're going to get two quotes or two references to Charlie McCreevy in one budget. But of course, he set up the National Pension Reserve Fund, which at the time was a very visionary thing to do. The receipts from Aircon went into it. There was the commitment to pay money in over time, whereby, and that was specifically then to look at pensions. Okay, history kind of got in the way, and that particular initiative didn't last. The money was required during the Great Financial Recession. But nevertheless, that notion of putting money aside and building up funds in that sort of long-term perspective, I think is something that is really to be valued. The increase in PRSI, while modest, even that notion of sort of saying, yes, we haven't increased the pension age, but we were aware that there's a long-term problem, I think that, again, deserves to be applauded. So I'll leave it there, and we look forward to the questions.